光锐很健谈的各位观众朋友，你们好。本期节目又迎来了本频道的特点之一——双语节目。我这里选的是一位巴基斯坦将军 Mohammad Yusuf 所撰写的，可以说是回忆录熊蟹 The Bear Trap。 这本书的主体部分讲的是那场著名的阿富汗战争。他作为一个巴基斯坦的前线将军，调到了阿卡塔将军的手下，是调到了巴基斯坦三军情报局，The Inter-Service Intelligence， 实际上是当了这摩加海丁这阿富汗圣战者游击队的辅导员，直接的手把手的教他们，当然还提供武器装备训练等等各方面支持他们打了那场让苏俄北极熊唯一一趟这满地找牙的惨败的这么一场山地游击战。这本书其实主要是讲这个，但是这本书最开始的那一段讲的是1988年8月17日的一起特别事件，一起非常特别的事件。我这就不多解释了就切入英语状态了明白的朋友自然也就明白了。 Prologue. Thea's death must have been an act of God. Benazir Bhutto, Daughter of Destiny, 1988. The crash. When the camouflage-painted Pakistan Air Force C-130 transport aircraft hit the ground, it did so at an angle of 65 degrees. It was nose diving, flaps up, wings level, landing gear up and locked, with all four engines functioning normally. It impacted at 190 knots. After a brief moment, a monstrous ball of orange flame consumed it as the fuel tanks exploded. Both clocks in the flight deck later showed 3:55 p.m. exactly on a clear, bright day, a few miles north of the small garrison town of Bahawalpur. Precisely 5 minutes earlier, it had lifted off at the start of a 17-minute flight to Islamabad. After some 2 minutes of terror, all on board had the merciful relief of instantaneous oblivion. It was August 17th, 1988. Moments before, Hafiz Tajib Muhammad, who was walking towards his field near the village of Dahar Kamal, near the Saltage River 8 miles north of Bahawalpur, heard the roar of engines and looked up. He watched incredulously at the lumbering plane, which was still rising steadily through 5,000 feet, suddenly dropped its nose to fly almost straight at the ground. Before, with some superhuman effort, it climbed again. Then, as though its strength had finally gone, it plunged down to extinction. To the man below, there was no outward reason, no missile, no mid-air explosion, no fire, no engine trailing smoke, nothing to forewarn of such a disaster. Dead were the President of Pakistan, General Zia-ul-Haq, and the man who might have succeeded him had he survived, General Akata Abdur Rahman Khan, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee. Gone were the two most powerful men in Pakistan, the head of state and the man who for 8 years until 1987 headed the ISI. At a stroke, the Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen, had lost their two most influential champions. Dead were the U.S. ambassador, Mr. Arnold Raphael, who had known the president for 12 years, and Brigadier General Herbert Watson, the U.S. defense attaché in Islamabad. Dead also were 8 Pakistani generals with their staff and the crew, 31 persons in all. Disquietingly, Neither President Zia nor General Akata should have been aboard the plane. Both had been persuaded against their wishes to attend a demonstration of a solitary American M1 battle tank, which the US was keen to sell to the Pakistan Army. It was not a function that required their presence. Such a comparatively low-level event would normally have been handled by the Vice Chief of Army Staff, General Murtaza Aslam Beg. It was the first time Zia had left the heavy security of his official residence since he had dismissed the government of Prime Minister Junot 3 months before. It was only on August the 14th that Zia had finally given in to the pressure from his former military secretary and the defense attaché in Washington, Major General Mohammad Duran, now commanding the Armored Division. He insisted that the president's presence was diplomatically desirable and would give added weight to the Pakistani delegation. After all, Zia had retained the post of Chief of Army Staff. Against his better judgment, he agreed to go. Similarly, General Akata had no intention of going to Bahawalpur until a mere 12 hours beforehand. His change of mind was brought about by the persistent phone calls of a former director in ISI to the effect that Zia was about to make some controversial changes in the military hierarchy, about which Akata should know. Akata consulted with the president, asking for an urgent meeting. Zia, who was by then committed to the tank demonstration trip, suggested Akata accompany him as they could discuss things on the aircraft. The fate of both was sealed. The call sign of the president's plane was PAC-1, but the actual aircraft he would use was not selected until shortly before the flight. Usually, 2 of the C-130s based at the Air Force Base at Chaklara, a few miles from Islamabad, were earmarked. Then, once the decision was taken, the VIP passenger capsule would be lowered into the aircraft and secured shortly before takeoff. This was a 21-foot long by 8-foot wide plywood and metal structure weighing 5,000 pounds, which was fitted out to give some comfort, including an independent air conditioning and lighting system, to an otherwise notoriously uncomfortable aircraft interior. The second aircraft, PAC-2, would follow PAC-1 as a backup. There was a routine security search of both planes prior to departure. For this flight, however, there was a problem. The airstrip at Bahawalpur was small and could only accommodate 1 C-130. So PAC-2 would land 150 kilometers away at Sangdaha. Once the president left Chaklara, there was no possibility of his changing aircraft. There would, however, be 2 other smaller planes on the airfield. The first was the Cessna, whose task was to circle the vicinity of the airport as a precaution against the missile-armed terrorists. This had been routine practice since an unsuccessful missile attack 6 years earlier. Then there was the 8-seater plane of General Beg, who, as the official host, had to get the small plane that would take him and the ambassador south if the crash was sabotage. The 2 Americans were not part of the target. The actual demonstration in front of so much army brass was a big embarrassment to the Americans. The much-vaunted Abrams tank failed to score many hits, and the billion-dollar deal evaporated in the enervating heat. While the president and the senior officers at lunch at the officers' mess, PAC-1 sat on the tarmac, baking in the sun. An armed military guard was on duty around the aircraft, but there had been a minor fault with a cargo door so the 7 crew technicians worked on it. The pilot, Wing Commander Mashhud Hassan, who had been personally selected by Zia, together with his co-pilot, navigator, and engineer, arrived back at the plane for pre-flight checks in advance of the passengers. These 4 men would be seated on the elevated flight deck, which was separated from the VIP capsule by a narrow door at the top of 3 steps on the left side of the aircraft. Zia, with his party, arrived at around 3:30 p.m. and knelt towards Mecca before seeing his farewells. He had persuaded both the senior U.S. officials to join him for the return flight. They did so with no apparent concern. General Begg made excuses when the president tried to prevail upon him to board Pac-1. He would use his own plane, as he had business to attend at Lahore. It was a known practice of Zia's to fly with the maximum number of top generals or officials to minimize the risks of a sabotage plot. Shortly before departure, 2 craters of Mongols arrived for the VIPs, which were loaded in the rear without any check, together with a case of model tanks. Strapped into the sofa and easy chairs inside the VIP capsule were Zia, Akata, Chief of the General Staff, Afzal, Raphael, Watson, and the President's Military Secretary, Brigadier General Najib Ahmad. Zia, Raphael, and Akata sat close together, so they could chat during the flight. Although conversation is difficult, as the C-130 is an excessively noisy aircraft. At 3:46 p.m., Pac-1 lifted off after the Cessna security plane reported nothing untoward. On the flight deck, the takeoff routine had been uneventful, with clear communication to the control tower. The fact that the aircraft lacked neither a black box flight recorder or a cockpit voice recorder would later be the subject of censure. But at liftoff, none of the crew or the passengers had the slightest hint of the catastrophe that was little more than 2 minutes away. Mashhud gave his arrival time at Islamabad over the radio as the plane pulled up onto the sky and began to turn on to its correct course. On the ground, General Begg's pilot was preparing to take off. At Sangodaha, Pac-2 was airborne, as was the Cessna. All were on the same radio frequency as Pac-1, so all heard the ground controller request Pac-1's estimated position, and the response, standby. Then, nothing. No mayday call, total silence, despite the increasing frantic calls from the control tower, as it was realized that something was radically wrong. To the passengers, the horror of the sickening plunge, with bodies hanging by their safety belts, unable to move, screams drowned by the uninterrupted roll of the engines, was indescribable. Then, the sudden, few fleeting moments of relief as the plane seemingly came under control and started climbing again, with the occupants lowering in the opposite direction or jammed hard back into their seats. But finally, yet another terrifying dive as Pac-1 gave up the struggle to survive. The culprits. In judicial terms, it was neither misadventure or murder. When the news broke, the chances of finding any Pakistani who believed it was an accident were 1,000,000 to 1 against. Zia was a man with opportune enemies. There has been at least 6 previous attempts at assassination, including a near miss by a missile fired at his plane. Probably his most uncompromising opponents within Pakistan were the Bhutto family. Zia had, despite the international outcry to commute it, confirmed the death sentence on the present Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto's father. This, to the man who, as Prime Minister, had personally picked Zia, then the most junior Lieutenant General, for promotion of Chief of Army Staff over the heads of his seniors. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had made a decision that 3 years later he would pay for with his head. On April 4th, 1979, he was hanged in Rawalpindi jail. Thereafter, the family feud was unrelenting. Zia imprisoned Benazir Bhutto and her mother, banned Bhutto's political party, and had his sons, Shahnawaza and Mir Mojatta, convicted of serious crimes in absentia. In exile, Mir Mojatta established an anti-Zia terrorist group named Al-Zulfikar in Kabul, where it shared offices with the PLO. From there and Damascus, it carried out a campaign of killing and sabotage, which in 1981 included the hijacking of a Pakistan International Airlines passenger jet. Then, in 1985, Shahnawazi died a painful death in sinister circumstances in Paris, it being rumored that he had been poisoned by Zia's agents. There was, and still is, an implacable hatred between the two families. Benazir Bhutto claimed the crash was an act of God before going on to win the general election 3 months later to become Pakistan's first woman prime minister. Zia was a military man who, along with Akata, was the last officer to have been commissioned from the Indian military academies just before the partition of India in 1947. Once in politics, he would often boast that the armed forces are my constituency, and he never vacated the post of Chief of Army Staff that Bhutto had given him. But even within the military, he had few friends. He quickly developed an uncanny knack of spotting potential rivals for power. These were removed from the scene by sacking or posting to positions well away from the political center at Islamabad. His only role as Chief of Army Staff had been to vet the promotions and the postings of all officers to the rank of Major General or above. Numerous disgruntled service chiefs were secretly delighted that Zia was dead. Potential assassins were not restricted to Pakistanis. Ever since Zia had backed the Mujahideen in their struggle against the Soviets and their Afghan allies, Pakistan had been swamped with Jihad agents bent on undermining his government by a terror campaign of bombing civilians. Jihad is the Afghan secret police organization trained and advised by the KGB. At the top of its hit list was President Zia, closely followed by General Akata. The Soviets were withdrawing from Afghanistan solely because Zia had given secretary to the Mujahideen and had, for 9 years, been arming, training, and advising them in a bloody guerrilla war that had cost the Soviet military 13,000 lives. The USSR blamed Pakistan for continuing to encourage and supply the Mujahideen in their attacks during the withdrawal, which was half completed at the time of the crash. It had gone so far as to warn Pakistan through the US ambassador in Moscow that it intended to teach Zia a lesson. Then there was India. Pakistanis and Indians had slaughtered each other on 3 separate occasions in 1947, 1965, and 1971. India's Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was convinced that Zia was supplying weapons to Sikh terrorists. They had murdered his mother, and now several thousand armed Sikh insurgents were active in India. Zia was accused of meeting their leaders and giving shelter and training to the guerrillas inside Pakistan. To counter this, Delhi had established a special branch of its intelligence service with the unpretentious title of the Research and Analysis Wing, specifically targeted on Pakistan. Even the US government shed few genuine tears at Zia's death. It was the State Department's belief that Zia had outlived his usefulness. With the Soviets leaving Afghanistan, the last thing the US wanted was for communist rule in Kabul to be replaced by an Islamic fundamentalist one. American officials were convinced that this was Zia's aim. According to them, his dream was an Islamic power bloc stretching from Iran through Afghanistan to Pakistan, with, eventually, the Uzbek, Turkmen, and Tajik provinces of the USSR included. To the State Department, such a huge area shaded green on the map would be worse than Afghanistan painted red. The cover-up. The State Department would have much preferred an accident, some sort of technical failure, pilot error, anything rather than sabotage. If it was murder of 2 high-ranking US officials, then the American public would expect, indeed demand, to know the culprits. For such an outrageous act of terrorism, the outcry against the perpetrators would be loud and long. The government would probably find it impossible to silence the clamor to exact retribution. Depending on who had done it, exposure would mean the ruin of US policy objectives in the area and elsewhere in the world. Supposing the KGB or their surrogates in Kabul were responsible, how would revealing the USSR as the organizer of mass murder of the assassination of a head of state affect the buildup of goodwill between East and West? How could the US avoid a major outbreak of hostility between themselves and the USSR? Almost certainly, the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan would be reversed. The implications of Moscow being to blame were unnerving. Similarly, the dilemma was almost as serious if the plotters were within the Pakistan military. If investigation uncovered a clinch of anti-Zia generals, the American people would be outraged that after all these years of massive support to the Pakistan armed forces and the Mujahideen, they had killed a US ambassador and a brigadier general. It would be futile to say they hadn't intended to. US-Pakistan relations would be in ruins. Aid would have to be curtailed. The military might be forced into prolonged presidential rule. The democratic elections scheduled for November would be abandoned. And with them, the prospect of the more acceptably moderate Benazir Bhutto becoming prime minister. As I have said earlier, the US was not sorry to see Zia go. The State Department was happy to see the Soviets out of Afghanistan, but decidedly unhappy with the likelihood of, as the US perceived it, Zia-backed fundamentalists take over in Kabul. Nor did it like his determination to have nuclear weapons. By mid-1988, Zia was becoming a liability rather than an asset to the US. Though unlikely it was conceivable that some minor political faction or terrorist groups, like al-Zulfaqar, had somehow achieved the impossible. The problem was, when serious investigation started, there was no knowing what unwelcome worms might emerge from the camp as the lid was lifted. Testifying before the House of Representatives Judicial Subcommittee on Crime in June 1989, then Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Armitage justified the lack of any serious investigations into the sabotage by claiming, hopefully moving Pakistan in a more democratic manner. The military in Pakistan, as well as their presidency, just being decapacitated. We were very alarmed there might be some backsliding. In other words, they were quite prepared to write off Ambassador Rafael's and Brigadier Warsom's murders, if that meant not rocking the boat. The State Department did four things immediately after the crash, which taken together point unerringly at a cover-up. First, within hours, it sent a team of purely technical Air Force advisors to assist the PAF board inquiry. Secondly, it did not insist through its embassy on autopsies on the bodies of the victims, particularly the crew, but rather allowed them to be buried, knowing that essential evidence as to how the crash was caused was being buried with them. Thirdly, it sent a Deputy National Security Advisor, Robert Oakley, to take over Rafael's post. He could be relied upon to sit on the lid of the can. Later, in June 1989, he told a highly skeptical subcommittee that when he attended the National Security Council meeting to decide on the U.S. response to the crash, he simply forgot all about the long-arm law. This, despite the fact that he had personally lobbied hard to get it passed. Fourthly, and most importantly, it vetoed the FBI's request clearance, and on August 21st, had been given it verbally, but within hours, it had been withdrawn, probably on the instructions of Oakley, who was by then in Islamabad. General Bagh, who had just avoided dying with his president, had circled the burning wreckage in his own aircraft before flying straight to Islamabad. There, troops were alerted, key points protected, and a crisis cabinet meeting called. But there was no military takeover. Bagh accepted immediate promotion to Zia's old post of Army Chief of Staff, while the civilian chairman of the Senate, the 73-year-old Guham Ishaq Khan, took over as head of the interim government. The November election would go ahead. 好嘞，我这念的并不是彻底的全啊，涵盖了大部分啊，但中间跳过了一些就如同开始说的那样，愿意听的啊，就可以参考一下，很有意思的内容。好嘞，这期就是这些内容，谢谢大家围观。